When my ex-wife took the last apartment I owned, 20 years ago, she stood outside the courthouse, looked down at my shoes, and told me I'd never be anything but a broke nobody. Last Saturday, that same woman invited me to her $1 million wedding, sat me beside the restrooms so everyone could stare at my cheap suit, and waited for me to embarrass myself. She had no idea that before the night was over, I'd be standing in front of 300 guests with a microphone in one hand and the documents that could destroy her new husband's entire life in the other. The wedding was being held in one of those places where even the air feels expensive. Crystal lights hung from the ceiling, cameras moved between the tables, and waiters carried champagne that probably cost more per bottle than my first car. Sophia stood in the middle of it all in a white dress covered in tiny stones, smiling like she had finally won some competition nobody else knew they were playing. Her new husband, Henry, was 15 years younger than her, tanned, polished, and wearing a watch he kept turning toward the cameras. Every few minutes, somebody would raise a glass and call them the perfect couple. I sat in the back, close enough to hear the kitchen doors slam every 30 seconds, and watched Sophia glance at me with that same little smile she used to give me in court. She believed I was still the man she had left, with 2 garbage bags of clothes and nowhere to sleep. Honestly, I understood why. I drove to the wedding in a 6-year-old Ford. My suit came from a regular department store. I didn't wear a fancy watch, and there were no articles about me online. When people asked what I did, I usually said I worked in property management. That answer made most of them lose interest immediately. Sophia had always judged people by what they displayed, so to her, quiet meant poor. Simple meant unsuccessful. She never once considered that a man could own half the room and still walk into it without announcing himself. 20 years earlier, we had nothing. I mean nothing. Our first apartment had brown water stains across the ceiling, a heater that worked only when you kicked the side panel, and a kitchen so small we had to open the oven door to use it as extra counter space. I was 27, Sophia was 25, and back then she could make eating cheap noodles on the floor feel like some romantic adventure. We used to sit by the window at night, looking at the lights from the nicer buildings downtown, and promise each other that one day we'd have our own place, not rented, ours. I worked maintenance during the day and cleaned office buildings at night. Sophia handled phone calls and invoices for the small repair business we started together. At first, it was just me fixing sinks, patching walls, and replacing broken locks. Then we hired one guy, then another. Within 4 years, we had 6 employees, 2 vans, and enough saved for a small apartment. It wasn't luxury, but I remember standing in that empty living room after we signed the papers, running my hand over the wall like I couldn't believe it belonged to us. Sophia hugged me from behind and whispered, "We did it." I believed her. That's the part that still gets me sometimes. I truly believed every late night, every missed weekend, every dollar we saved was building something for both of us. I didn't notice that somewhere along the way, Sophia stopped saying we and started saying I. She wanted better restaurants, better clothes, better friends. She became embarrassed by my dirty work boots. When clients came into the office, she introduced herself as the person running the company and called me the field guy. I laughed it off because I was tired, and because when you love somebody, you can explain away almost anything. Then a man named Victor started showing up. He owned a construction company twice the size of ours and drove a black Mercedes that Sophia could hear pulling into the parking lot before she saw it. At first, she said he was bringing us contracts. Then there were dinners I wasn't invited to, calls she took outside, and weekends when she claimed she had to meet suppliers. I knew something was wrong, but I didn't want to say it out loud. Saying it would make it real. One night, I came home early because a job had been canceled. The apartment was dark except for the light above the stove. Sophia was sitting at the kitchen table with a glass of wine, and Victor's jacket was hanging over the back of my chair. I remember staring at that jacket longer than I stared at either of them. My brain kept trying to find some harmless reason for it to be there. Then Victor walked out of my bedroom, buttoning his shirt. Sophia didn't cry. She didn't apologize. She folded her arms and said, "This marriage has been dead for years. You were just too busy working to notice." 2 weeks later, I was served divorce papers at a job site. By then, she had already moved company funds into an account I couldn't access. She had copies of every contract, every receipt, every financial record. Victor introduced her to a lawyer who knew exactly how to make me look reckless, unstable, and financially irresponsible. They argued that Sophia had built the business while I had mismanaged operations. They claimed several debts were mine alone because my signature was on the equipment loans. I sat in court, listening to my own life being rewritten by people who had prepared for months, while I was still trying to understand what had happened. The apartment went to Sophia. The business went to Sophia. Most of the debt came to me, and because she claimed she had sacrificed her own career to support my work, the judge ordered temporary alimony that was almost impossible for me to pay. Outside the courthouse, I asked her how she could do this after everything we had built. She stepped close enough that I could smell her perfume, looked at the cracked leather on my shoes, and said, "Because you're weak, Daniel. You always were. Without me, you'll be nothing." Then she spat near my feet, turned around, and walked toward Victor's Mercedes. That night, I rented a room in a house with 3 strangers. The mattress sagged in the middle, the walls smelled like cigarettes, and somebody had punched a hole through the bathroom door. I put my 2 garbage bags on the floor, sat on the edge of that bed, and stayed there until the sun came up. I didn't cry. I couldn't. My whole body felt numb, like I had been thrown out of my own life and was watching somebody else live it. By 7 that morning, I had made one decision. Sophia could take everything I had built, but she wasn't going to decide what I became next. For the first year, I worked like I was trying to outrun something. Maybe I was. I took every repair job I could get, even the ones nobody else wanted. Flooded basements, burned out electrical panels, apartments filled with mold and roaches. I worked during the day, cleaned commercial buildings at night, and delivered construction supplies on weekends. 18 hours became normal. I slept 4 or 5 hours when I was lucky, usually in my clothes, because taking off my boots felt like one more task I didn't have the energy to finish. Every month, I sent Sophia the alimony payment before I paid my own rent. Not because I wanted to, because her lawyer would call the second it was late. Sometimes I lived on crackers, canned soup, and coffee for a week, just to make sure that payment cleared. I remember one winter night, sitting in my car outside a gas station, staring at the fuel gauge. I had enough money to either buy gas for the next day's jobs or eat dinner. I bought gas. Then I drove back to my rented room and drank water until my stomach stopped making noise. The depression didn't look dramatic. I didn't spend every day crying or staring out a window. It was quieter than that. I stopped answering friends. I stopped listening to music. I stopped caring whether my clothes were clean, as long as they didn't smell bad enough for clients to notice. I'd look in the mirror sometimes and barely recognize the guy looking back. My face got thinner. My hair started turning gray near the sides. There were mornings when I sat behind the wheel with the key in my hand and honestly didn't know if I had enough strength to turn it. What kept me moving was anger, not the loud kind. I wasn't smashing walls or planning revenge. It was this hard little thing sitting in my chest, reminding me of what Sophia had said outside the courthouse. "Without me, you'll be nothing." Whenever I wanted to quit, I heard her voice. So I'd turn the key, drive to the next job, and keep going. About 14 months after the divorce, I was repairing pipes in the basement of an old commercial building. The owner was a tired man in his 60s named Harold. He had bought the building years earlier, but the upstairs offices were empty. The basement flooded whenever it rained, and the city had started sending him notices. While I worked, he sat on an overturned bucket and complained that the property was costing him more than it made. "How much would you take for the basement?" I asked. He laughed because he thought I was joking. "What the hell would you do with a basement that smells like sewage?" "I'd clean it." "And then what?" "I don't know yet." He shook his head and told me the basement wasn't legally separated from the rest of the building. But over the next few weeks, I kept asking questions. I learned about commercial subdivisions, tax liens, code violations, and seller financing. I spent nights at the public library reading property records because I couldn't afford professional databases. Harold eventually agreed to sell me a small rear section of the building with its own street entrance if I took responsibility for fixing the drainage system. I didn't have enough money for the down payment, so I sold my tools, borrowed from two people who barely trusted me, and used credit cards with interest rates that should have scared me away. The place was dark, wet, and full of broken furniture. Everybody who saw it told me I was an idiot. For 3 months, I worked on it after finishing my regular jobs. I replaced pipes, removed rotten drywall, painted the exposed brick, installed cheap lights, and built 2 simple storage rooms. Then a restaurant owner from across the street asked if he could rent one room for dry supplies. A delivery company rented the other for packages and equipment. Their combined rent covered my loan payment and left me with a few $100s each month. That few $100s felt like a fortune. I didn't spend it. I saved every cent. 6 months later, Harold called me again. One of his upstairs tenants had left, and he needed money fast. I bought a small office unit from him under another seller-financed deal, renovated it, and rented it to an accountant. Then I bought a garage behind a closed furniture store. Then a tiny warehouse nobody wanted because the roof leaked. I didn't have some genius master plan. I just looked for ugly properties owned by exhausted people, places too small for major investors and too damaged for regular buyers. I understood repairs, and I wasn't afraid of bad smells, broken concrete, or long nights. I could walk into a building everyone else hated and see what it might become after 3 months of work. The first time I sold a property, I made almost $40,000 after expenses. I stared at the number on the closing statement for so long that the attorney asked if something was wrong. Nothing was wrong. I had just never seen that much money attached to my name before. I used all of it to buy 2 more buildings. By the 5th year, I owned 11 commercial units through a small company. By the 7th, I had partners. By the 10th, banks started returning my calls instead of laughing at me. We bought struggling warehouses, office buildings, storefronts, parking lots, and apartment blocks. Sometimes we renovated and sold them. Sometimes we held them and leased them. Sometimes we bought the debt instead of the building and waited until the owner came to us. That was when I founded Northbridge Capital Holdings. The name sounded bigger than it was at first. It was me, one attorney, an accountant who worked part-time, and a receptionist who also ordered office supplies. But I wanted every property separated from me personally. Each building sat inside its own limited company, and all those companies were owned by Northbridge. My name appeared on private beneficiary documents and banking records, but not on signs, advertisements, or public brochures. That setup became useful as we grew. People knew Northbridge, but almost nobody knew me. By the time I turned 45, the company owned properties in 4 states. At 48, my net worth passed $10 million. I found out during a quarterly meeting when my accountant slid a report across the table and said, "Congratulations, technically you're a multimillionaire." I looked at the report, then looked at him and said, "Do I still have to come in tomorrow?" He laughed. Unfortunately, I drove home that night in a used Toyota with a dent in the rear bumper. My house was comfortable, but not huge. I had no sports cars, no private planes, no yacht, and no interest in letting strangers online know what I ate for lunch. I bought good shoes because my feet hurt, decent coffee because I'd spent too many years drinking garbage, and a quiet cabin near a lake where I could disappear for weekends. That was enough. Maybe I stayed simple because I remembered what it felt like to choose between dinner and gasoline. Maybe part of me was afraid that showing off would turn me into the kind of person Sophia respected. Either way, I learned that money was most powerful when nobody saw it coming. 20 years after the divorce, I was walking through one of our warehouse renovation sites when my phone rang. I almost ignored it because the number wasn't saved. My shirt was covered in dust, my boots were muddy, and a contractor was arguing with me about a damaged loading door. I answered with, "Daniel speaking." For a second, there was only silence. Then a woman laughed softly and said, "Wow, you still sound exactly the same." My hand tightened around the phone before my mind even understood why. I knew that voice. "Sophia?" She gave another little laugh, like my surprise amused her. "So you do remember me." I stepped away from the loading bay because one of the workers had started a saw behind me. "What do you want?" Straight to the point. "You really haven't changed." That wasn't true. Everything about me had changed. She just couldn't see any of it through a phone. I looked down at my dusty jeans and the faded work shirt I wore whenever I visited a construction site. If she had seen me right then, she probably would have felt confirmed in every opinion she'd ever had about me. "I'm getting married," she said. I honestly thought I had misheard her. "Okay, that's all you have to say?" "What do you want me to say, Sophia? Congratulations?" "Well, yes, that would be normal." I rubbed the bridge of my nose. 20 years had passed, and somehow she could still make a simple conversation feel like I had already done something wrong. "Congratulations." She paused, waiting for more. When I didn't give her anything, she said, "His name is Henry. He's 35. He owns a logistics company and several fitness centers. He's doing very well." The way she said it told me exactly why she was calling. This wasn't news. It was a performance. "That's great," I said. "He's not threatened by successful women." I almost laughed, but I stopped myself. "Good for him." Another silence followed. I could hear traffic on her end and the faint clink of dishes. She was probably calling from some cafe, sitting there with sunglasses on, imagining my face while she listed Henry's achievements. "I'd like to see you," she finally said. "I have something for you." "No." "Oh, come on. We're not children anymore." "That's exactly why I'm saying no." "It's only coffee, Daniel. 20 minutes, unless you're still bitter." There it was. She knew how to push. If I refused, she would tell herself I was wounded. If I agreed, she would think I was curious about her life. Either way, she had already written the version of the meeting she wanted. I should have hung up. Instead, I said, "Tomorrow, 1 o'clock, Miller's Cafe on 8th. She sounded disappointed by the location. "That little place near the bus station?" "Yes." "Fine, I'll be there." The next day, I came directly from a property inspection. I could have gone home first. I could have changed into a tailored suit, brought one of the company cars, or asked my assistant to reserve a private room somewhere expensive. I did none of that. I arrived in work boots, dark pants, and a gray jacket with a small tear near one pocket. My truck was parked around the corner because the cafe lot was full. Miller's hadn't changed much in 15 years. The tables were scratched, the coffee was too hot, and the ceiling fan made a clicking sound every few seconds. I chose a booth near the back and ordered black coffee. Sophia arrived 12 minutes late. At first, I almost didn't recognize her. Her hair was lighter, her lips looked fuller, and her face had that smooth, tight look people get when they spend a lot of money trying not to look their age. She wore oversized sunglasses, a cream coat with a designer logo printed across the belt, and enough perfume to reach the table before she did. The handbag on her arm was supposed to be expensive, but the stitching gave it away. It was fake. A good fake, but still fake. She stopped beside the booth and looked me up and down. "Oh, Daniel." The pity in her voice was so obvious that I nearly smiled. "What?" "Nothing." She slid into the seat across from me and carefully placed her bag where I could see the logo. "You just look very practical." "I came from work." "You're still doing repairs?" "Something like that." She nodded slowly, as if this was exactly what she expected. "I always said you were good with your hands." A waitress came over. Sophia asked whether they had almond milk, sugar-free vanilla syrup, and imported mineral water. The waitress stared at her for a second and said, "We have coffee, cream, and tap water." Sophia sighed. "Coffee, then." When the waitress left, Sophia removed an envelope from her bag and placed it between us. Thick paper, gold lettering. My name was written on the front by hand. You're invited, she said. I didn't touch it. Why? Her eyebrows lifted. Because you were an important part of my life. No, I wasn't. You made that very clear. She leaned back and crossed her arms. See? Still bitter. I'm not bitter, I'm confused. She smiled, but her eyes stayed cold. Henry knows about you. I told him everything. I doubt that. I told him how we struggled, how I helped build your little company, how difficult the divorce was. You mean, how you took the company and left me with the debt? Her smile tightened. That's your version. It's also the court record. She waved her hand like the details bored her. I didn't come here to argue about the past. I want you at the wedding. I think it would be good for you. Good for me? To see what life can look like when a woman chooses the right man. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The fan clicked above us. A bus hissed to a stop outside. Sophia took a careful sip of coffee and watched me over the rim of the cup, waiting for that sentence to hurt. It didn't. Not anymore. So Henry's the right man? I asked. He built everything himself. Logistics, commercial transport, fitness clubs, luxury property. He has over 200 employees. Impressive. It is. He knows people, real people. Politicians, investors, athletes. Our wedding will have almost 300 guests, and there'll be press coverage. Why would the press care? She lowered her voice like she was sharing classified information. Henry's company is expanding internationally. That caught my attention, not because I believed her, but because the name Henry still meant nothing to me, and men with the kind of business she described usually crossed Northbridge's radar somewhere. What's his full name? Her face brightened. She mistook the question for jealousy. Henry Caldwell. I kept my expression neutral. He's younger than me, obviously, she continued, touching her hair, but he says women his age are immature. He appreciates experience. I'm sure he does. She either missed the tone or chose to ignore it. Then she leaned forward and lowered her voice. I want you to come, Daniel. Honestly, I think closure is important. Closure happened 20 years ago. Then prove it. Come celebrate with us. I picked up the invitation and slipped it into my jacket. Fine. Her eyes widened slightly. She hadn't expected me to agree so quickly. Really? Really? A slow smile spread across her face. Good. I want you to see how real men live. I looked at her for a long second, then reached for my coffee. Now I'm curious, I said. She left 10 minutes later, walking toward a white convertible parked directly in front of the cafe. Before getting in, she turned to make sure I was watching. I raised my cup slightly. She smiled and drove away. I stayed in the booth until her car disappeared. Then I took out my phone and called my attorney. Rachel, I said when she answered, I need everything you can find on a man named Henry Caldwell. Companies, properties, loans, lawsuits, leases, all of it. How soon? Today. She heard something in my voice and didn't ask why. I'll get the team on it. I looked down at the gold wedding invitation in my hand. For the first time since Sophia had called me, I had the feeling that this meeting wasn't an accident. And by the end of that day, I understood just how right that feeling was. Rachel called me just after 6 that evening. Her voice was calm, but I had worked with her long enough to recognize the tone she used when something unexpected landed on her desk. You're still at the office? I just got back. Good. Don't leave. I looked through the glass wall of my office at the last few employees packing their bags. The cleaning crew had already started vacuuming the hallway. How bad is it? That depends on your definition of bad. I'll wait. 25 minutes later, Rachel walked in carrying a thick blue folder, followed by Ethan from our finance department and one of our senior analysts. None of them looked amused. Rachel dropped the folder onto my desk. You weren't kidding when you said everything. I figured if Sophia was making this much noise about him, he had to be worth looking into. Rachel opened the folder. Daniel, Henry Caldwell owns almost nothing. I frowned. What do you mean, almost nothing? I mean exactly that. She turned the first page toward me. This is Caldwell Logistics. A polished company profile, professional branding, luxury offices, hundreds of employees, beautiful promotional photos. Exactly the kind of company Sophia had described. Then Rachel flipped a page. Actual assets? She smiled without humor. One delivery van. I blinked. One? One. Ethan slid another document beside it. The rest are leased. The trucks? All leased. The warehouses? Leased. The office? Leased. The gym chain? Management contracts and leased facilities. I leaned back. So he's leveraged. Rachel shook her head. No, she tapped another document. He's underwater. The room became quiet. Ethan opened his laptop. His public image is excellent, he said. Instagram followers, business podcasts, magazine interviews, charity galas. Everything screams billionaire. But his actual cash flow is collapsing. He rotated the screen toward me. Rows of overdue invoices appeared. Outstanding supplier balances, bank restructuring notices, tax extensions, missed payments, several legal warnings. How long? Almost 8 months, Rachel continued. Banks won't refinance him anymore. Suppliers? Demanding cash. Investors? Pulling out. And leases? Rachel slowly smiled. This is where it gets interesting. She reached deeper into the folder and placed another stack of papers in front of me. At first, I didn't understand what I was looking at. Then I noticed one familiar logo, Northbridge Commercial Holdings. Then another, Northbridge Industrial Properties. Then another, Northbridge Business Centers. I stared at Rachel. These are ours. Yes. How many? All of them. She spread the agreements across my desk one after another. The downtown headquarters, our building, the executive offices, our building. 3 regional warehouses, our buildings. 6 fitness centers, our buildings. Parking structures, loading facilities, storage depots, conference space. Every single lease traced back through subsidiaries to Northbridge. To me. For nearly 30 seconds, nobody spoke. Finally, I asked, how much does he owe? Ethan answered quietly, just under $18 million. I honestly thought I had misheard him. Repeat that. $17,843,000. The number just sat there. Rachel pointed toward another page. He stopped making full lease payments 4 months ago. Only partial payments? Exactly. He's been moving money between companies trying to buy time. And nobody escalated? Rachel nodded. They did. She handed me another document. You just never saw it. I looked closer. Routine collection notices, formal demands, late payment penalties, default warnings. Each one had been handled exactly the way our procedures required, because Northbridge owned thousands of leases. No one had flagged Henry as special. He was simply another tenant falling behind, until today. I slowly closed the folder. So the billionaire, Rachel finished my sentence, is renting his empire. Ethan couldn't help smiling. Not just renting it. He's renting it from you. I actually laughed. Not loudly. Just once. Because the situation was almost too absurd to believe. 20 years after Sophia called me a worthless nobody, she had somehow managed to fall in love with a man whose entire public image depended on property he didn't own. Rachel wasn't finished. There's more. Of course there is. She pulled out another report. This wedding. I looked down. Estimated cost, venue, decorations, live orchestra, celebrity host, imported flowers, designer catering, fireworks, luxury honeymoon. The total sat near the bottom of the page, $1.3 million. I looked back up. You're telling me he owes almost $18 million? Rachel nodded. And he's spending over $1 million on a wedding. Yes. With borrowed money? Yes. Why? Nobody answered immediately. Finally, Ethan shrugged. Image. Rachel folded her hands. If people think he's successful, banks keep talking to him. Investors hesitate before leaving. Suppliers give extensions. Future clients stay confident. He isn't financing a wedding. He's financing an illusion. That sentence stayed in my head. Financing an illusion. I stood and walked toward the window overlooking downtown. Somewhere out there, Sophia was probably trying on another wedding dress, calling photographers, choosing flowers, telling her friends she'd finally found the man she deserved. She had absolutely no idea that the entire stage beneath her feet belonged to someone else. Rachel broke the silence. One more thing. I turned around. What? Our collections department already prepared final enforcement documents. She slid over another folder. Eviction notices, acceleration clauses, debt enforcement, personal guarantee filings, all legally ready. I opened the first page. Everything had been drafted. Everything had been reviewed. Everything was waiting for one signature. When? Rachel answered immediately. If we execute tomorrow. I shook my head. No. She looked surprised. You're postponing? Yes. How long? I closed the folder. Until Monday morning. Why Monday? I looked down at the gold wedding invitation still lying on my desk. Because the wedding is Saturday. Rachel stared at me for several seconds. Then realization slowly spread across her face. You're going. Yes. She smiled. And you're going to let him believe he's still the king of the world. I smiled back. For one more weekend, the room became completely silent. Finally, Ethan leaned back in his chair. I almost feel sorry for him. I looked once more at Henry's financial statements, then at Sophia's invitation. No, I said quietly. Save your sympathy. They're about to discover the difference between looking rich and actually owning something. The next morning, I met Rachel and our litigation team in the conference room before anyone else arrived. A stack of legal binders sat in the middle of the table, each one tagged with colored tabs. There wasn't anything dramatic about it. No secret plan, no loopholes, just contracts, unpaid invoices, and the consequences Henry had spent months pretending didn't exist. Rachel opened the first binder. If you sign today, collections will start immediately. I shook my head. Change the execution date. To Monday? Yes. 9 o'clock? Exactly 9. She made a note. That gives him 48 more hours. It gives him his wedding. One of the younger attorneys looked confused. You're intentionally letting him have the weekend? Yes. Why? Because legally nothing changes. He already owes the money. The defaults already exist. We're not creating a problem. Rachel finished my thought. We're simply choosing when to enforce it. Exactly. No one argued after that. Our company wasn't interested in revenge. We enforced contracts every week. Tenants who paid stayed. Tenants who didn't eventually lost their leases. Henry wasn't special. The only unusual part was that I happened to know the bride. By lunchtime, every document had been updated. The notices would be delivered electronically at exactly 9 Monday morning. Process servers were already scheduled. The banks financing several of Henry's operations would receive copies that same day, as required under the lending agreements. Within hours, cross-default clauses would begin activating. It was nothing more than business. That was the part I kept reminding myself. Late Friday afternoon, my phone buzzed. A text from Sophia, just making sure you're still coming tomorrow. A second message arrived before I could answer. Black tie starts at 6. I know tuxedos are expensive, so don't worry if you can't rent one. I've already told security you're my guest, so they won't judge your clothes too harshly. I stared at the screen for a moment. 20 years. 20 years. And she still couldn't help herself. I typed only one sentence. I'll be there. 3 dots appeared immediately. Then another message. Wonderful. Just remember, this is Henry's night. Please don't make things awkward. I put the phone down without replying. Rachel, who was sitting across from me, reviewing another file, looked up. Sophia? I slid the phone across the desk. She read the messages, sighed, and handed it back. She really has no idea. No. Do you ever wonder if she would have treated you differently if she'd known who you became? I thought about the question longer than I expected. Sometimes. And I don't like the answer. Rachel nodded. Neither do I. Saturday morning felt strangely ordinary. I mowed the lawn behind my house, stopped by a hardware store, picked up coffee, spent an hour reviewing next week's acquisition reports. Anyone watching me would have assumed I had no plans at all that evening. Around noon, I drove to a department store downtown. A salesman approached almost immediately. Looking for a tuxedo, sir? No. A formal suit? Yes. He showed me imported Italian brands that cost more than the first used truck I had ever owned. I thanked him and walked toward the simpler section. Eventually, I chose a dark navy suit that fit well, but looked completely ordinary. No designer label, no flashy buttons, no silk lapels, just clean lines and good fabric. The salesman looked almost disappointed. You don't want something more impressive? This is impressive enough. When I got home, I hung it on the closet door and looked at it for a second. It reminded me of something my father used to say. If your confidence depends on the price tag, you're wearing the wrong clothes. He died before Sophia and I were married. Sometimes I wondered what he would have thought of everything that happened afterward. By 5:30, I was driving toward the venue. The restaurant sat on a hill overlooking the river, surrounded by perfectly trimmed gardens and rows of imported trees. Luxury cars filled the entrance, Bentleys, Ferraris, Range Rovers, a couple of Rolls Royces. Valets hurried between them, while photographers waited near the front steps. I handed over the keys to my old Ford. The young valet looked at it, then looked at me. You're here for the wedding? Yes. He smiled politely. Of course. There wasn't any judgment in his voice, only surprise. As I walked toward the entrance, I recognized the building immediately. Not because I'd eaten there often, because Northbridge had purchased the property 6 years earlier through one of our hospitality subsidiaries. We leased it to a restaurant group under a 20-year agreement. The manager probably had no idea who I was. Most tenants didn't. Inside, the lobby glittered with fresh flowers and polished marble floors. A string quartet played softly near the staircase, while guests posed for photographs. A hostess smiled at me. Your invitation, please. I handed it over. She checked the seating chart. Oh, yes. There was the tiniest hesitation. Then another employee appeared beside her. If you'll follow me. We walked past the center tables, where local politicians, television personalities, and business owners were already laughing over champagne, past another section reserved for Henry's investors, past the family tables, past the dance floor, past the dessert displays. We kept walking until the music became quieter and the smell of food from the kitchen started replacing the perfume in the ballroom. Finally, she stopped beside a small round table tucked against the wall, less than 20 feet from the restroom entrance. Every few minutes, someone would walk past on their way to the bathrooms. The swinging kitchen doors were directly behind me. A waiter carrying dirty plates brushed past my chair before I had even sat down. The table held 6 guests, an elderly uncle who seemed half asleep, 2 distant cousins arguing about lottery tickets, a woman scrolling through her phone without looking up, a teenage boy wearing headphones under his jacket. And me, I smiled. The seating chart wasn't an accident. Someone had worked very hard to make sure everyone important would see exactly where Sophia had placed her ex-husband. I hadn't even unfolded my napkin when I heard heels clicking across the floor. Well, look who actually came. I looked up. Sophia stood beside my table in her wedding gown, surrounded by 2 bridesmaids and a photographer following a few steps behind. She slowly looked me over, from my shoes to my ordinary navy suit. Then she smiled. Oh, Daniel. She turned toward the photographer. Can you get one picture of us together? Without waiting for my answer, she stepped beside my chair, resting one hand lightly on my shoulder like we were old friends. The flash went off, then another. She leaned closer and whispered so only I could hear. I knew you'd wear something like this. I looked at her calmly. I thought you said black tie. She smiled even wider. I also said you should come in whatever you could afford. Then she patted my shoulder, turned toward the ballroom, and raised her voice just enough for the nearby tables to hear. I hope you're comfortable back here. Before I could answer, another voice joined the conversation. Is this him? I turned. A tall man with perfect hair, an expensive tuxedo, and a gold watch the size of a compass walked toward us with absolute confidence. Henry. He smiled like someone arriving to inspect an employee he'd already decided not to hire. Henry walked over with one hand in his pocket and the other wrapped around a glass of champagne. Up close, he looked exactly like the kind of man who spent more time maintaining an image than building a business. His smile was polished, his shoes were flawless, his cufflinks caught the light every time he moved his wrist, as though he'd practiced the angle in front of a mirror. Sophia slipped her arm through his. Henry, this is Daniel, my ex-husband. Henry looked me over from head to toe, smiled politely, then laughed under his breath. So you're the famous Daniel. I guess. Sophia told me all about you. I hope not all. He laughed louder than the joke deserved. Oh, don't worry. Ancient history. He extended his hand. I shook it. His grip was firm for exactly the amount of time someone trying to impress people would think was appropriate. Well, he said, I'm glad you came. Thanks. You know, it takes confidence to show up at something like this. I raised an eyebrow. Does it? Oh, sure. He looked around the ballroom. Seeing what someone else built? It can't be easy. Sophia smiled proudly beside him. I simply nodded. You're probably right. Henry mistook my calmness for defeat. He leaned closer, like he was doing me a favor. Sophia tells me you're still working construction. Property work. Well, that's honest work. It is. If you're ever looking for something more stable, he patted my shoulder. I've got warehouses all over the state. We always need reliable security guards. The nearby guests laughed politely, not because it was funny, because they thought they were supposed to. Henry smiled like he'd just delivered the line of the evening. You'd look good in a security uniform. I smiled back. That's generous. I'm serious. I know. I always help hard-working people. That's admirable. He seemed almost disappointed that I wasn't offended. Well, he said, enjoy yourself. I plan to. They walked away toward the center of the ballroom. As soon as they disappeared into the crowd, the elderly man sitting beside me leaned over. You handled that better than I would have. I smiled. I've had 20 years to practice. He chuckled quietly. My name's Frank. Daniel. Sophia's second cousin. You don't seem very impressed with all this. Frank looked around the ballroom. Kid, I've lived 76 years. He lowered his voice. The louder people tell you they're successful, the less I usually believe them. Before I could answer, music filled the room. The ceremony began. For the next hour, I simply watched. Henry loved cameras. Every entrance was timed. Every kiss waited for photographers. Every toast paused until the videographers adjusted their angles. Even the first dance looked rehearsed to the second. Guests applauded everything. Champagne flowed endlessly. The room buzzed with conversations about Henry's companies. I heard he's buying property in Miami. Didn't he just open another fitness center? My cousin says he's negotiating overseas. I listened quietly. Every sentence added another imaginary floor to a building that didn't actually exist. At one point, two businessmen at the neighboring table started discussing commercial real estate. Henry joined them. I couldn't help overhearing. The biggest mistake landlords make, Henry said confidently, is believing they control the tenant. One man asked, Really? Henry nodded. Always remember this. He lifted his wine glass. A smart businessman never depends on one landlord. I nearly laughed into my water, if only he knew. Around 8:30, dinner was served. The kitchen doors behind my table swung open every few seconds. Servers rushed past, carrying steaks, seafood, desserts, and expensive wine. Each time they passed, someone from another table glanced toward ours, exactly as Sophia intended. Every once in a while, she looked over. Whenever our eyes met, she smiled, not warmly, victorious, like she was still standing outside that courthouse 20 years earlier. After dessert, the band took a break. The master of ceremonies stepped onto the stage. He was energetic, perfectly dressed, and clearly experienced. Ladies and gentlemen, the room quieted. What an incredible evening! Applause. We've heard wonderful words from Henry's business partners, from Sophia's family, from lifelong friends. He looked toward the newlyweds. But every great love story has a past. Sophia's smile widened. And tonight, he glanced a card in his hand. We're honored to have someone very special with us. I already knew what was coming. The MC continued. Sophia specifically requested that her former husband share a few words. Laughter rippled through parts of the ballroom. Not cruel laughter, curious laughter. People turned in every direction looking for me. Spotlights slowly swept across the room until one stopped directly on my table. 300 faces looked my way. The cameramen immediately repositioned themselves. One lens pointed directly at me, another moved toward Sophia. She looked almost excited. She wanted this. She wanted everyone to watch her ex-husband stumble through an awkward speech before disappearing back into obscurity. The MC smiled. Daniel, would you join us? Frank quietly whispered beside me. You don't have to. I looked at him. I know. Then I stood. The ballroom became strangely quiet as I walked toward the stage. Each step echoed softly against the marble floor. Henry leaned back in his chair with an amused grin. Sophia folded her hands in front of her dress, barely hiding her anticipation. The MC handed me the microphone. Take your time. Thank you. I looked across the ballroom. Hundreds of guests, photographers, videographers, business owners, family, friends. People who thought they already knew exactly how this story ended. I took a slow breath. First, my voice echoed through the room. I'd like to thank Sophia. Several guests exchanged confused looks. Sophia smiled even wider. She thought I was about to apologize, or beg, or embarrass myself. Instead, I continued. 20 years ago, the room grew completely silent. You left me with nothing. You could have heard a glass being set on a table. You took our apartment. Silence. You took our company. No one moved. You left me carrying debts I honestly didn't know how I'd survive. Henry's smile faded just a little. I looked directly at Sophia. For a long time, I said quietly, I hated you. No cameras moved now. Nobody whispered. Nobody even reached for another drink. Then I smiled. But tonight, I paused. I realized I owe you something. Confusion spread across Sophia's face. I owe you my gratitude. The ballroom looked stunned. If you hadn't left, I never would have rebuilt my life. If you hadn't underestimated me, I never would have pushed myself this hard. And if you hadn't spent 20 years believing I was still the same broken man, I reached inside my suit jacket, slowly, calmly, and pulled out a thick blue folder with the silver Northbridge Capital Holdings logo across the front. For the first time all evening, Henry stopped smiling. I rested the folder on the podium without opening it right away. Nobody in the ballroom knew what it was. To them, it looked like any other set of papers. Henry let out a short laugh and leaned back in his chair again. I knew it, he said loudly enough for the nearby tables to hear. He brought old court documents. A few guests chuckled. Sophia smiled with visible relief. She thought the same thing, that I had carried 20-year-old divorce papers to her wedding because I couldn't let go. I looked at Henry. No, I opened the folder. These aren't old documents. I lifted the first page. They were printed yesterday. The laughter stopped almost instantly. I turned another page. Henry Caldwell. His expression changed just a little. These documents concern Caldwell Logistics, LLC. He frowned. What is this? I ignored the question. I wasn't speaking to him anymore. I was speaking to the room. I spent most of tonight listening to people congratulate Henry on building an incredible business empire. Several guests smiled politely. Some even nodded. I heard people mention warehouses. I looked at Henry. Offices, another page. Fitness centers, another. Distribution facilities. Henry shifted in his chair. This isn't funny. No, I agreed. It isn't. I held up a lease agreement. This building. I slowly turned toward the ballroom, the headquarters located on West Jefferson Avenue. I looked back at Henry. You don't own it. A few confused faces appeared around the room. You lease it? Henry forced a smile. So what? I picked up another agreement. The warehouse on Riverside. You lease that too, another page. The logistics depot outside Franklin. Leased, another. The executive office downtown? Leased, another. The fitness centers in Brookhaven, Mason, Oak Ridge, and North Point. I looked directly into Henry's eyes. All leased. The room became noticeably quieter. Someone whispered, "What is he talking about?" Henry laughed. Every businessman leases something. Of course. I nodded. Many do. Then I lifted one final document. The interesting part isn't that you lease them. I paused. The interesting part is who you lease them from. Henry's smile disappeared completely. I turned the page around so the front tables could clearly read the heading, Northbridge Capital Holdings. I watched Henry's face carefully. Recognition, then confusion. Then something much closer to fear. You know that name, I said quietly. His lips parted. No sound came out. I continued. For those of you who don't, I looked across the ballroom. Northbridge Capital Holdings is the parent company that owns every commercial property I just listed. I let the sentence settle, and I am its sole beneficial owner. Silence, absolute silence. One of the photographers actually lowered his camera. Henry stared at me without blinking. Sophia looked from him to me, then back again. She was trying to understand whether this was some kind of joke. It wasn't. I opened another section of the folder. These documents also include payment records. Henry stood up. That's enough. I looked at him calmly. No. It isn't. He took one step toward the stage. You have no right. Rachel had warned me this might happen, which was exactly why two of Northbridge's senior attorneys quietly stood up from separate tables near the back of the ballroom. Neither of them said a word. They simply looked at Henry. He stopped walking. I continued reading. 4 months. The words echoed through the ballroom. That's how long your companies have failed to make full lease payments. Henry swallowed. I read another line. Current outstanding balance. I looked up briefly. $17,843,000. A woman near the front gasped. Someone dropped a fork. I heard a glass break somewhere behind the dance floor. Henry finally found his voice. You're lying. I calmly held up the signed contracts. These bear your signature. He looked at them. He knew every page was real. You promised me a job as a security guard. I smiled politely. I appreciate the offer. A few nervous laughs escaped around the room. The problem is, I pointed toward him with the folder. Your warehouse belongs to me. I pointed toward the windows overlooking downtown. Your corporate office belongs to me. Then toward the ballroom floor. And unless the restaurant manager has secretly purchased this property without telling us, I looked around the room. This restaurant belongs to me too. Nobody laughed now, not one person. I continued. You've spent the last 4 months ignoring legal notices. I know. I've read every one of them. You postponed payments. You requested extensions. You promised funds that never arrived. Henry's face had turned completely pale. Small beads of sweat appeared along his forehead. You used that money. I looked slowly around the ballroom. To pay for this wedding. The sentence hit harder than I expected. Guests immediately started looking at one another, then toward Henry, then toward Sophia. She grabbed his arm. Henry! He didn't answer. She shook him harder. Henry! Still nothing. I closed the folder. My attorneys have already completed every enforcement document. Henry whispered, no. They're signed. His breathing became noticeably faster. They've been reviewed. He took another step toward the stage. Please. They become effective Monday morning. I checked my watch. At exactly 9 o'clock, the ballroom seemed frozen. I looked directly at him. At 9:01, your eviction process begins. At 9:02, your lenders receive notification. At 9:05, your cross-default clauses activate. At 9:10, your creditors begin calling. At 9:15, your empire starts disappearing. Henry stared at me like he'd forgotten how to breathe. Then he whispered the only thing he could think of. You planned this. I shook my head. No. You did. No, Henry. I looked him straight in the eyes. You planned this. You chose not to pay your leases. You chose appearances over obligations. You chose $1 million wedding instead of $17 million in debt. You built your own collapse. I simply chose not to interrupt it before dessert. No one moved. No one spoke. Then Sophia slowly released Henry's arm. She looked at him with an expression I'd never seen before. Not anger, not sadness, pure disbelief. Her voice barely carried across the ballroom. Tell me. She swallowed hard. He's lying. Henry closed his eyes. He didn't answer. He couldn't, because every person in that room had just watched the truth arrive carrying a blue folder instead of a weapon. For what felt like an eternity, nobody moved. 300 people sat frozen in complete silence. The orchestra had stopped playing halfway through my speech. Even the waiters stood motionless beside their carts, unsure whether they were supposed to keep serving dinner or simply disappear. Then Sophia finally looked at Henry. Her voice trembled. Tell me he's lying. Henry swallowed. He's exaggerating. I didn't say a word. Rachel quietly stepped forward from the back of the ballroom and handed another folder to one of our attorneys. Neither of them spoke. They simply stood there. Sophia grabbed Henry's arm harder. Henry! He forced a smile that looked painful. It's temporary. What is? The cash flow. She blinked. The debt. It's just business. I watched her face change. Confusion, hope, doubt, fear. How much do you owe him? Henry hesitated. Henry. It's complicated. How much? He still didn't answer. She screamed this time. How much? His shoulders dropped. About 18 million. The words echoed through the ballroom like a gunshot. Several guests gasped. Someone near the front whispered, Oh my God. Sophia slowly let go of his arm. 18. She looked around the ballroom at the flowers, the orchestra, the giant wedding cake, the imported champagne, the walls covered in white roses. Then she looked back at Henry. You told me everything was paid for. It will be. When? I just need a little more time. A little more, she laughed, not because anything was funny. It was the kind of laugh people make when their brain refuses to believe reality. You spent over $1 million? Her voice cracked. When you were almost 18 million in debt? Henry reached for her. Sophia, listen. She slapped his hand away. No. I can explain. No. It isn't what it looks like. No. Every answer came louder than the last. Around them, conversations exploded across the ballroom. You knew about this? Did you seriously borrow money for a wedding? I thought he owned those buildings. My cousin invested with him. I told you something felt off. Phones began appearing. People weren't recording anymore. They were calling lawyers, accountants, business partners, investors. Henry looked around in panic, as if he suddenly realized every important relationship in his life was collapsing at the same time. Then Sophia's father stood up. Robert was a large man with silver hair and the kind of face that always looked one sentence away from shouting. He pointed directly at Henry. You told me your company had record profits. Henry didn't answer. I asked you 3 times before writing the check. Silence. I paid almost $400,000 toward this wedding. Still nothing. Robert slammed both hands onto the table, so hard the glasses jumped. Was any of it true? Henry finally spoke. I was going to recover. When? The new contracts? What contracts? The expansion. What expansion? The financing. What financing? Every answer made things worse. Sophia's mother suddenly burst into tears. My friends. She covered her face. My God, my friends are here. Meanwhile, Henry's best man had quietly stepped away from the head table and was already typing furiously into his phone. One by one, several of Henry's business associates followed. Nobody wanted to be standing too close to a collapsing empire. Henry finally turned toward me. His confidence was gone completely. He walked across the ballroom so quickly he almost stumbled over one of the chairs. Daniel, I looked at him calmly. We can fix this? I don't think so. No, listen. He lowered his voice. Please. It was almost strange hearing the word. 2 hours earlier, he'd offered me a job as a security guard. Now, he was practically whispering. I'll catch up on the payments. You've had 4 months. I just need another 60 days. Our collections department already gave you 4 extensions. I know. You ignored everyone. He rubbed both hands across his face. I made mistakes. Yes, I can still pay. With what? My investors. They're leaving. My banks. They've frozen new lending. My assets. You don't own them. Every answer hit him harder than the previous one. His breathing became faster. Finally, he whispered, Don't do this here. I looked around the ballroom. You chose this place. Please. You invited 300 witnesses. I'll sign anything. You already signed everything. His eyes filled with panic. I'm begging you. Several guests had quietly gathered close enough to hear every word. Nobody interrupted. Nobody defended him. Henry looked like a man drowning while everyone watched from the shore. I'll pay every dollar. I shook my head. This stopped being about promises months ago. I'll sell everything. You can't sell what isn't yours? He actually reached toward my arm. Before he could touch me, Rachel stepped smoothly between us. Mr. Caldwell. Her voice remained perfectly professional. I strongly recommend that any further communication regarding your leases be directed through legal counsel. Henry stared at her, then at me, then back at Rachel. He finally understood. This wasn't personal revenge. It wasn't anger. It wasn't emotion. It was simply business, the same business he had ignored for months. Behind him, Sophia suddenly screamed, Henry! Everyone turned. She had picked up one of the lease agreements I had left on the podium. Her hands were shaking violently. This address... She looked at him. Our penthouse. Henry closed his eyes. She flipped another page. The beach house. Another. The fitness clubs. Another. Our offices. Each document carried the same logo, Northbridge Capital Holdings. She looked back at Henry with absolute horror. You don't own anything. He didn't answer. You lied to me. Silence. You lied about everything. Then, with one furious motion, she pulled off her wedding ring and threw it at him. It struck him just below the eye before bouncing across the marble floor. The tiny sound of gold sliding across stone somehow seemed louder than every shout that had filled the ballroom. That was the moment the wedding truly ended. Family members rushed toward the stage. Friends started arguing. Someone accused Henry of fraud. Someone else demanded repayment of an investment. The orchestra quietly packed away their instruments. The photographers stopped taking pictures. The wedding planner sat down on a chair and buried her face in her hands. I looked at the room one last time. 20 years earlier, I'd walked out of a courthouse believing my life was over. Tonight, I walked toward the exit without saying another word. Nobody tried to stop me. Nobody laughed. Nobody even looked at my inexpensive suit anymore. They were too busy watching the illusion collapse behind me. As I reached the front doors, I heard one final sound echo through the ballroom. Not music, not applause, just Sophia crying as she realized she'd spent her entire life chasing appearances. only to marry a man who owned nothing except debt. I didn't look back when the doors closed behind me. The night air felt colder than it had an hour earlier. The valet hurried over with my keys, but before he handed them to me, he hesitated. Sir, yeah? I've worked weddings here for almost 8 years. He shook his head. I've never seen anything like that. I smiled a little. Neither have I. He handed me the keys to my old Ford. As I drove away, I could still see flashing lights from television cameras arriving at the entrance. News traveled fast in this city, especially when wealthy people embarrassed themselves in public. I turned onto the highway, rolled down the window, and let the cool air fill the truck. For the first time in 20 years, I felt absolutely nothing towards Sophia. Not anger, not satisfaction, not revenge, just peace. Monday morning, I was already in my office before 8. At exactly 8:59, Rachel walked in carrying a tablet. Everything is queued, I nodded. She looked at the clock on the wall. 1 minute. Neither of us spoke. When the second hand reached 12, the clock changed to 9 o'clock. Rachel pressed one button. Electronic notices delivered, another. Process servers dispatched, another. Lenders notified, another. Default enforcement initiated. She looked up. It's done. There was no dramatic music, no celebration, no cheering. Just contracts being enforced exactly as they were written. By lunchtime, Henry's attorneys had already called 3 times asking for emergency negotiations. Rachel handled every conversation. The answer never changed. Northbridge is willing to discuss repayment after all outstanding obligations are acknowledged in writing. No acknowledgement ever came. Instead, lawsuits began. Within 2 weeks, several of Henry's largest creditors joined the proceedings. His banks froze additional credit. Suppliers demanded immediate payment. Investors withdrew completely. One by one, the companies that had existed mostly on borrowed money stopped operating. Without leased warehouses, there were no deliveries. Without offices, there were no executives. Without the fitness centers, there was no membership revenue. The public image disappeared much faster than the debt. 3 months later, Caldwell Logistics entered formal liquidation. The remaining assets were sold under court supervision. There wasn't much to sell. Most of what people believed Henry owned had never belonged to him in the first place. The expensive cars had been financed. The luxury furniture had been leased. Even several pieces of artwork hanging in his office had come from a rental company. When everything was over, the numbers were almost sad. After years of pretending to be worth hundreds of millions of dollars, his actual personal estate barely covered a fraction of what he owed. As for Sophia, the marriage lasted 23 days. 23. Before the wedding photographs were even delivered, both of them had already filed lawsuits against each other. She accused him of fraud. He accused her of damaging his reputation. Their attorneys spent months fighting over money that neither of them actually had. The tabloids loved every minute of it. People who had once begged for invitations to their wedding now pretended they had never known them. Funny how quickly crowds change direction. About 4 months after the wedding, I was leaving a meeting when my phone rang. Unknown number. I answered without thinking. Hello? Silence. Then a familiar voice. Daniel. I recognized it immediately. Sophia. She sounded older than she had just a few months before, not physically, emotionally. I know you probably don't want to hear from me. I didn't answer. I've been thinking a lot. Still nothing. We were young. I looked out the window. We made mistakes. She laughed weakly. I guess mostly I made them. Another long silence. I've been remembering our first apartment. I closed my eyes for a second. The little kitchen. The window overlooking downtown. The nights we ate noodles on the floor. I don't know why I've been thinking about those days so much. I finally spoke. Because back then you were happy. She started crying. I ruined everything. I didn't argue. I thought money was all that mattered. I remembered the woman standing outside the courthouse 20 years earlier, the expensive perfume, the look of absolute certainty in her eyes, the words she'd thrown at me like they were a life sentence. Without me, you'll be nothing. Now her voice barely rose above a whisper. Do you think? She hesitated. If things had been different, I stopped her gently. No. More silence. I just wanted to say, I'm sorry. I know. I really am. I believe you. She took a shaky breath. Can we ever? No. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't insult her. I simply told the truth. No. Another quiet sob came through the phone. I understand. I hope you find peace, Sophia. You too. The line went dead. I looked at the number for a few seconds. Then I blocked it. Not because I hated her. Because some doors should never be opened twice. People sometimes ask me whether exposing Henry at that wedding was revenge. Honestly, no. Revenge would have been destroying him when I first discovered the debt. I could have. Instead, I let the contracts speak for themselves. Henry wasn't ruined because of one speech. He was ruined because he spent months choosing appearances over responsibility. Sophia wasn't ruined because of one wedding. She was ruined by decades of believing that wealth could be measured by watches, cars, designer labels, and public attention. The greatest lesson I learned wasn't about money. It was about character. Real success doesn't need to announce itself every time it enters a room. Real strength doesn't need to humiliate other people to feel important. And time has a strange way of exposing every mask eventually. If there's one thing this entire story taught me, it's this. The ultimate betrayal isn't just breaking trust. It's the ability to smile to someone's face while holding a knife behind their back. A coward never acts in the open because they are driven entirely by fear. They fear strength. They fear the truth. But most of all, they fear accountability. Yet history proves one thing. Anyone who builds their success on the tears and betrayal of others will eventually end up with nothing, trapped in a cage of their own loneliness, with not a single soul left to pity them. Sometimes people ask whether I regret going to that wedding. I always give the same answer. No. Because I didn't go there to destroy anyone. I went there to witness the moment the truth finally introduced itself. And the truth never needed an expensive suit to be recognized.